The streets of London were silent under a heavy blanket of frost. The gas lamps flickered weakly, their glow swallowed by the black sky. Inside his cold, cavernous home, Ebenezer Scrooge sat hunched by a meager fire, his fingers bony and brittle as he clasped a quill. A ledger lay open before him, rows of numbers marching like grim soldiers. Scrooge muttered to himself, a habit born of solitude. His voice echoed faintly in the empty room, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Shadows flickered on the walls, elongated and strange, their edges curling like smoke. He paused, looking over his shoulder, the feeling of being watched gnawing at the edge of his mind. "Bah!" he grumbled, shaking off the unease. "Humbug." The words no sooner left his lips than a strange sound filled the room, a low, metallic rattling, like chains dragging across stone. He froze. The noise grew louder, accompanied by a chilling wind that extinguished the fire and plunged the room into darkness. "Who's there?" Scrooge demanded, his voice trembling. The answer came as the shadows on the walls convulsed and pulled together, coalescing into the form of a man. Jacob Marley. But this was not the partner Scrooge had known in life. Marley's face was pale and warped, his eyes gleaming with a malevolent light. Chains writhed around him like living things, their links engraved with jagged, glowing runes. "Jacob," Scrooge whispered. "Did you think I was gone forever, Ebenezer?" Marley rasped, his voice like the groan of rusted iron. Scrooge shivered, clutching the arms of his chair. "Why do you torment me?" "Torment?" Marley's grin stretched unnaturally wide. "This is no torment. It is a warning. You are worse than I ever was, Ebenezer, and the darkness that claimed me hungers for you." "What darkness?" Scrooge demanded, though his voice quavered. Marley drifted closer, the air growing colder with each step. "3 spirits will come to you tonight," he said, his voice carrying an undertone of malice. "They will show you what you refuse to see. But heed me, Ebenezer. They are no mere guides. They are drawn to your corruption. They will strip you of everything, and when you have nothing left, they will consume you." "Enough of this nonsense!" Scrooge shouted, but his defiance wavered. Marley's chains lashed out like tentacles, brushing against Scrooge's chest. The cold burned as if searing his very soul. Scrooge gasped, clutching his heart as Marley's form dissolved into the shadows. The last thing he heard was Marley's laughter, echoing like a distant funeral bell. When Scrooge awoke, his room was bathed in an eerie, sepia-toned light. A figure stood at the foot of his bed, cloaked in gauzy, tattered robes. Her face was skeletal, her hollow eyes glowing faintly like dying embers. In her hand, she clutched a cracked lantern that flickered with an unnatural light. "Who are you?" Scrooge stammered. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," she whispered, her voice brittle and sharp, like the crunch of dried leaves. "Come. Your sins lie buried in the shadows of memory." The room dissolved, replaced by the schoolroom of Scrooge's childhood. But something was wrong. The air was damp and stagnant, and the walls were cracked and crumbling. A young boy sat at a desk, his thin frame hunched over a book. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse and breathe. "This is not how it was," Scrooge said, shaking his head. "You've forgotten the truth," the spirit whispered. "Even as a boy, you spurned love, clinging instead to ambition. Do you remember the first time you heard its voice?" Scrooge turned sharply. "Whose voice?" The spirit gestured to the far corner of the room, where the shadows thickened into a monstrous silhouette. Its form was indistinct, a mass of darkness that exuded a palpable malice. It seemed to watch them, though it had no eyes. "What is that?" Scrooge demanded, his voice trembling. The spirit said nothing, only leading him through more memories. He saw Belle, the woman he had once loved, walking away from him as her form dissolved into ash. He saw workers he had dismissed, their faces gaunt with hunger. In every scene, the shadowy figure loomed in the background, silent and watching. Scrooge awoke with a start, but there was no time to catch his breath. A second figure stood before him now, a hulking, grotesque being wrapped in rotting greenery. Its bloated form reeked of decay, and its laughter was sharp and mocking. "Look upon your world!" it roared, dragging Scrooge to the streets of London. The bustling city was transformed into a nightmare. The people moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their faces twisted and hollow. Children clawed at scraps of food in the gutters, their limbs thin and angular as if they were barely human. Scrooge tried to turn away, but the spirit grabbed him with its swollen hand, dragging him to the Cratchit household. Tiny Tim sat by the fire, his face pale and still, his small crutch propped uselessly against the wall. The family huddled around him, their faces gaunt and streaked with tears. "No," Scrooge whispered. "I can fix this. I can help them." The spirit's laughter roared like thunder. "Can you? Will you?" Before Scrooge could answer, the world dissolved once more, and he was plunged into darkness. The final spirit was waiting for him. It stood cloaked in shifting shadows, its presence oppressive and cold. It pointed with a skeletal hand, and Scrooge found himself in a graveyard choked with weeds. The spirit led him to a headstone, and his stomach turned as he read the name, Ebenezer Scrooge. But the grave was not still. The earth writhed and pulsed as if something beneath it was alive. "No," Scrooge whispered, stepping back. "This cannot be my fate." The spirit pointed again, and Scrooge saw himself, not as a man, but as a twisted, inhuman creature. His face was warped, his fingers elongated into claws as he clutched at piles of gold that burned his flesh. "Please," Scrooge cried, "I can change." The spirit said nothing as its cloak wrapped around him, dragging him into the churning darkness. Scrooge awoke with a gasp. Sunlight streamed through the window, and the bells of Christmas morning rang out. "I've been given another chance," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. He leapt from his bed and ran to the window, throwing it open. The streets below were alive with the sights and sounds of Christmas. But as he called out, no one looked up. The people moved in jerky, unnatural motions, their faces blank. Scrooge turned back to his room, his heart pounding. The shadows on the walls twisted and convulsed, forming monstrous shapes that loomed over him. In the mirror, he saw not his own reflection, but Jacob Marley, grinning with cruel delight. "Did you think it would be so easy, Ebenezer?" Marley's voice echoed, low and mocking. "This is your punishment. Every Christmas you will wake, thinking you've been redeemed, only to relive the torment you've sown. Forever." Scrooge screamed as the world dissolved around him, the clock striking midnight once more. And so it was, that Ebenezer Scrooge was trapped in a never-ending purgatory, reliving his failures and horrors each Christmas, with no hope of escape.
Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.